Do you know how to make friends with the Danes? Get a bunch of best practice today. Hi, I'm Monika Chutnik, and I help leaders learn how to lead their international and virtual teams. Together with my team at ETA Leadership and Culture, we make the change happen by means of training, coaching, or facilitation. This podcast, A Step Ahead, has been created for all who want to grow in such an international remote environment, who want to grow as leaders, as HR, as change agents, and simply as humans. I'm inviting you here for discoveries and insights. All recording and materials are available at www.astepahead.pro. Denmark. It is said to be one of the happiest countries in the world. It has been named the happiest country of the world on numerous occasions and remains to be very near the top, the United Nations World Happiness Report. This language has no word for please. How is it possible? But instead, it has a very nice word for the cozy feeling of togetherness, the hygge. There are so many interesting facts about Denmark, but it's even more interesting to know how to come and live in this country, how to make friends with Danish people. And this is why I'm having Kathy Borys Siddiqui as an amazing guest today. And let me first, Kathy, ask you to tell us a bit about yourself. So what brought you to Denmark? What do you do professionally? How are you into these topics?
Thank you so much for having me, Monika. I'm really pleased for us to have this conversation about Denmark and hygge and friendships and working in Denmark. So yes, how did I make my way to Denmark, the land of Hygge and Vikings and Hans Christian Andersen? It was a bit of a winding path. I came to Denmark because of love. My husband is Danish. So if we were to label, I would say that I could call myself a love pat. And it was about almost 14 years ago that I arrived in Denmark. It was in Odense first, so actually it's the third largest city in Denmark. It is the birthplace of Hans Christian Andersen, and it's a magical, beautiful city. However, it was a difficult journey for me, and we can get into that. So I clashed a bit with Denmark and with the Danish culture, and partially because probably of my assumptions and expectations that I had in my head of how it would be to move to this country. I have traveled also most of my life. So I've lived abroad from the age of 8. I lived in Germany. I grew up in the United States. And then I was repatriated back to Poland, to my hometown of Poznan. And there I was studying cultural studies, languages and translation. I worked as a business English teacher for some years and ended up meeting my husband there. And we decided that it would be a great idea to move to Denmark. It would be easier for me than it would be for him. And so I ended up here in Denmark, now in Copenhagen.
So Danish is known for being a bit easier than Polish. Is this what you're saying?
No, I think it's a really difficult language, partially because there are certain sounds that we don't use. And so the pronunciation is really, really difficult. Also in Danish, you don't always pronounce the words the way they're written, so you lose some endings. It's quite tricky, and I have to say that I think there are a few of us that are expats or internationals that have mastered it really fully, because a lot of us struggle, and I think it's okay to say that. It's not an easy language. And I'm not objective because Polish is my mother tongue, so if I compare, I will always say that Polish is much easier, even though Polish is also a very difficult language.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about your experience of moving to Denmark that many years ago and how that experience actually might have brought you to what you are doing now professionally as an expert.
I would even go as far as saying that I think it was my childhood and also seeing my parents and seeing my family members living a life of being an immigrant. It was very difficult. I remember very well being away from family, being away from Poland and really missing my country, missing my family members. And I think that also made me think about that whole journey, and also that feeling of loss, feeling of grief, feeling of nostalgia that you feel not just for the people, but also for the place that you grew up in. So that was really difficult to understand as a child. And then when I got older, of course, I repeated this pattern because I moved then to Denmark from Poland. And it was the same feelings, but not as a child, but as an adult. So I started thinking about, what happens to us? How come it happens? What can we do to make these transitions easier? And that's how my business was born. I first was working with spouses and partners because I was a spouse and partner. So that was very close to my heart, and understanding that transition. It's very different when you move for work, even as a family. So if you have one family member who is coming for a job, but the other family member is not, so we have a whole unit, the whole family moving, the experience of each person will be very different.
Yes, that's very true. That's very true.
And I think it also requires a lot of good communication, a lot of awareness of what's happening to each one of us, being able to talk about it together, but also understanding ourselves. Most of the international spouses and partners I've worked with have always said the same thing. Once we start talking about the cultural adjustment phases, they kind of take a deep breath, and there's a release where they say, I thought it was just me. But now I can see that this is something, it's a process. It happens to most every person. I can also see people in the room that they can relate to me and I can relate to them. So we tend to think that there is something wrong with us, that we're not handling the situation as we should be. And it's really important to make sure that people understand that this is very normal. And I could talk about this for a long time, but the cultural adjustment phases are different. They're not different. There's a cycle, but people may experience it in different ways. So it's not always the same for each person. That's also really important to understand. And of course, it depends on our personality and the country that we're in, because I believe that sometimes it's like a relationship. We click with certain countries and there's a chemistry, and it's easier for us in some places than it may be in other places. So that's also important to know, that it's not always an ideal match.
Absolutely. Depending on where you come from as a culture of origin, but also what your individual preferences might be and so on. So this is how the story of your life brought you to what you're doing professionally, helping people in this psychological experience of establishing themselves in a new country, but also being an expert in the culture of the country, which is Denmark.
Yes. So there's that side, the more emotional, as you said, support for the spouses and partners. And also, of course, also all internationals, all expats. But I also work with international companies in Denmark to ensure that the international teams are thriving and working well together. So there we work with intercultural awareness and communication. And of course, there's a lot about Danish culture and how Danes work, but also about really finding ways of communicating with each other about where we come from, what our experiences have been, how come I work this way, or how come I react this way when, let's say, someone is joking, right? If we have a Dane and an international and there's really Danish humor involved. So you see sometimes that there's tension or potential of conflict because people don't understand each other's humor. So we also talk about that. We talk about the flat hierarchy. We talk about the humor. We talk about directness. We talk about, the approach to solutions and innovation. So there are a lot of different conversations, of course, depending on what the clients are looking for and what the pain points are, because it's important to find those as well and discuss them.
Yes, absolutely. So what do people discover when there are foreigners? They come to Denmark as expats, or the spouses or the families. What do they discover in the first place when they come to Denmark?
That's a hard question, Monika, because it depends on where they come. So people tend to think of Denmark as a whole because it's a small country. But it is really different depending on the regions. So we see that, for example, in Copenhagen, yes, it's true, Copenhagen is very, very international. And a lot of people who have moved directly to Copenhagen often don't have this big pressure to learn the language very fast and be fluent in the language because there is more room to work in English. Whereas if you move to Odense or Jutland, one of the cities in Jutland, that may be a huge difference, that you will be expected to learn the language very quickly and to also use it at work. So not just in private life, but also in professional life. But I think what people really see, generally speaking, one thing is that there's a lot of trust, that people trust each other. Most of the time we hear this, people say that they feel safe in Denmark. And for many people, this is a big difference. They also feel safe with their kids. Their kids can go out alone or take the bus, or there's not so many worries about such things. The other thing is I think people also see that being outside is very important to Danes. And when you live in Denmark, you quickly learn, especially in the seasons that we're entering into now, so spring and summer, that if there are sunny days, if there's lovely weather, people just tend to gravitate and be outside and really soak up that good weather, the sunshine, because come fall and winter, we really have a lot of darkness. Of course, this is, again, if we compare other countries, you and I have talked about this. If we take someone from Finland, they would laugh at us and say, you know, this is nothing compared to what we have in our country. But living here, we do face much more darkness than in other places in fall and winter. So being active, being outside is also something that we see. Something we notice as well is that maybe there's not as much engagement between people who don't know each other. So you wouldn't really find yourself in a small talk situation on a train with a stranger or at the supermarket. There's much more distance and privacy. And it's not because people are not friendly. It's a matter of respecting each other's privacy, especially if we don't know each other. Work-wise, I would say what people are usually surprised about is the directness and the flat hierarchy. So the directness, what I mean by that is that people will openly disagree with each other. People will openly voice their opinions during meetings and also challenge their bosses. This is something that's very welcome. So it's not to sit and nod your head and agree, but to actually say, I believe that maybe this solution would be better. And everyone has a voice. So everyone is expected to participate in meetings, from top management to student assistants. Everyone has a voice. And it's really, really seen as that you are taking initiative and that you're being active and that you are really interested in your work and in the meeting and the company and so on and so forth.
A concept that really has made an international career and is actually coming from Denmark is the famous Hygge. So in Poland, we are getting a lot of books published. You get cafes, which are named Hygge Place. And it seems to be a very big thing, having gone really international. So what is this Hygge for Danish people and how does it really work in practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is my personal opinion, and this is just me observing life here in Denmark, but I have shared this with you as well. I believe that Hygge has become a huge product.
Indeed.
And is sold in many, many different versions, from socks, mugs, the way kitchens look to, lighting. And yes, of course, we could talk about this for, many hours. Hygge is something very special. And I think people have wanted to kind of discover what it is. And so what comes out at us and what we think it is, it's the coziness of, covering yourself with a blanket or having a nice mug of hot cocoa. But really what I have observed and seen, that Hygge is more about people than things. So it's about spending quality time together in a circle of people that we trust, that we feel comfortable with. And it doesn't really matter what we're doing. It's about the togetherness. So that's the essence of Hygge for me and what I've observed with Danes. That I have that personal example of when we were running one morning. So my husband and I, our daughter was still small and she was in a running cart. It was quite chilly because it was beginning of fall. It was a Sunday morning. It was gray weather. I think it might have been even raining a tiny bit. She was covered with a blanket and she had a little book. And we were just out. And a man passed us on a bicycle and he said to us, "Oh, you guys are Hygge, but we're practicing Hygge." What that meant was, as a family, we were out together. And even though the weather wasn't good, we were still doing something that brought us joy, and we were together as a family. So it's that togetherness that's really, really important to Danes, and they really appreciate it. So it could be from a dinner party to, going for a walk together. Hygge is not really only, let's say, reserved to interiors, to a nice room. It can be anywhere as long as we feel a bond and the togetherness with people that we love and enjoy and like.
So maybe what we internationally are doing with Hygge is we make an interpretation of what it would potentially mean for us with all the candles and blankets, as you're saying, as a nice mug of coffee, for example, something like this. But I'm also thinking about what you said before. You mentioned that having this small talk or just having a chit chat with other people is not a usual thing in Denmark.
With strangers.
With strangers. In this case, when I come to Denmark and I'm a new person there, I am a stranger in the beginning. How do I make friends? How can I develop this, feeling of coziness and togetherness with people from Denmark? It's a long way, isn't it?
It is. It is, and I think it's probably one of the most asked questions. How do I become friends with Danes?
Everybody wants to become friends with
Everybody
Danes.
wants to become friends with them. And I think we really have to look at our individual situations. For many internationals, it's much easier to become friends with other internationals because it's easier to meet each other, especially if you don't know the language. So that is usually very often what happens. But of course, you can also think about, where could I meet the locals, like in any country. So Denmark is big on associations, on clubs, so sports clubs, clubs of any kind of hobby. That's where you will also find a lot of Danes. Of course, we always go back and forth with this. A lot of associations are purely Danish. So if you don't know the language, you will have a difficult time. Really kind of engaging and being a part of it. But it's also changing. There's more and more conversations that we're having about the fact that, we have a lot of internationals. Not all of them will be staying here forever. Not all of them will be learning the language fluently. So there's also a bit of, adjusting. How can we include more people? Especially now when we talk so much about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's not only at work, it's also in societies. We are trying to make room for everybody. And how do we do that? It's difficult because this comes with a lot of history and people are used to having things in their own language, their own way, which again is very normal because if we take any country, if we take our country of Poland, it's the same, right? If we go to a dance class, we have it in Polish and it's normal for us and we talk to other people in Polish. All of a sudden, if we have it in English, some people might say, oh, okay, this is a little bit strange. That's not what I signed up for. So it's a balancing act. But I think the way to meet Danes, I don't think it can be forced. I think a lot of people really, really try hard. I think sometimes if we just let go and really think about what is it that I like, what is it that I enjoy, what would I want to be a part of, I think it would happen more organically and then you would. Sometimes I say, maybe you won't be friends with the Danes because it's not the same for everybody. I have some Danish friends over the years now, but it's from networking. It's also our neighbors. We live on a street where everyone is very open. And so when we moved in, people came on that day we moved in and we had almost all the neighbors coming to welcome us. Other internationals have never had that. So it's so much based on circumstance and chance and depending on, what you do, where you live, how open you are, how much of an initiative you're willing to take, because it's also that. If you're expecting Danes to come to you and knock on your door and take you by the hand and say, hey, I belong to this great, football club, come with me. the chances of that happening are very, very slim. But if you're willing to put yourself out there and go and see what's available and try to join different clubs, associations, the chances are higher.
So what I'm reading from you is that trying to learn the language is a one important step. Another important step is really taking the initiative and looking for opportunities to meet together, to meet, let's say, locals.
Yeah.
Whoever they might be. And I'm thinking about my own experience. I can very well resonate with what you said. When I first moved to Finland, I was a student. I did not really care about learning the local language too much. Now I'm thinking it was a lost opportunity. But as an outcome, I was only able to speak some very basic Finnish, and I had plenty of friends, but all of them were internationals. So I came back from Finland, and as an outcome of having spent there a year, I realized that I hardly have any Finnish friends, but I have friends, in Spain, in Russia, in Germany, in Austria, in India, and so on. So that's one surprising thing. Indeed, I did not make an attempt to get into this culture, and it didn't happen by itself. Yeah. But then when I moved to Germany, I had those remorses. I thought about not losing my opportunity for the second time, and I did my best. So that time I was already able to speak the local language. Yeah. And indeed, I took many opportunities, for example, to go into a hiking club, to go into a language class, to go into a sports class. Yeah. And that's where many of my connections, many of my colleagues and friends are coming from. With them, I have been in a relationship, in contact for more than 20 years now. So this is what really makes it sustainable. I can very well relate to what you're saying. It must be the right way to go.
Yeah, but it's also interesting that you kind of reflected and you had, you learned your lessons, sort of say, and you said, this time around, I'm going to do it differently. I think that's important also, especially with people who move around a lot, to kind of think about, what do I want? Because as you said, sometimes it depends on where we are in life. Right? For some people who are students, maybe they're more into the whole, I'm studying right now and it doesn't really matter who's around me. I just want to meet people, different kinds of people. If you come maybe in your mid, 30s or 40s, you're looking for more of a local connection, especially if you know that you're staying long term or for many years. And you want to feel that sense of belonging also with the locals. So I think it's important for people to really think about where they are and what they're looking for. I don't think there's a wrong way. I don't think everyone has to do a deep dive and, just experience it fully head on. If it doesn't work for you right now, if you're looking for something else, that's okay.
At that time, my level of German was already sufficient to let me study in German. Okay. But I imagine that when people come to Denmark and first try to learn, first try to speak, this way might be longer in time. So what would you recommend if somebody is not yet able to speak the local language? It takes time to learn. Yes, it might take a year, 2 years, 3 years longer. Depending on the level of fluency that you want to reach. What if I don't have the language? Then how can I really make friends with the Danes?
As I said, you can try joining some clubs, see how that goes. And there's no guarantee. Really, it really depends on where you will find yourself and how badly you want it. But as I said before, I think if we force things, it sometimes has the opposite effect. So just taking a bit of initiative, joining different places, also joining networking groups, for if you are working and if you're not. So networking is a big thing in Denmark. Networking is huge. It's very, very important. And even when you have a job, people still network. Everything is based on network. So I would definitely also find a networking club or meetups of something that is interesting for you with your career, and then being able to meet people in that way as well. So it could be hobbies and leisure. It could be more professional. It could also be if you're thinking about changing your career, that's also a place where you might meet people because, after Corona, many people have had reflections on what they want to do, and they're also drastically changing their careers. So maybe taking a course, going back to the university, going back to adult courses. There are so many opportunities and so many options, but I would say be present and be involved, because we also have a lot of Danes who join events for internationals. Most of the time, it's Danes who've lived abroad themselves. So they are repats, and they're also looking to connect with people who are internationals. So there are many, many, many opportunities.
And you mentioned this sense of humor. I heard you say that the Danish sense of humor might be perceived in a specific way. Now, what is the Danish sense of humor? Can you maybe tell us more about that?
Again, I mean, we're generalizing, right? But overall, I would say it is very direct. It is very sarcastic. And some people might say, depending on where you come from, that it's inappropriate. So it can be a little bit crude at times, of course, depending on who we're talking to. But there's also this that often there is no filter between private and work. So you might find people joking about things that you would not necessarily at home have people joking about at a workplace. So there are a lot of nuances when it comes to humor. And it's important to really discuss it and talk about it because especially if we have people from different countries then translating jokes into another language, which may be English, that's where things can really go wrong because translating jokes, can get really, really kind of sticky. So I think we really have to be careful. But often we find the situations where people don't know if someone is joking in Denmark because Danes will joke and they will have a serious face. There is no kind of, punchline like you have in the US where people say, oh, I'm just kidding, where they let you know. Oftentimes people will say, I don't know if this person was joking or if they were serious. So also being able to learn to say to that person, I'm not really sure, were you joking? Because this is new for me. And people are shy about that, right? Because people don't want to look like they don't know. But we don't know the norms and certain behaviors if we're new to a country. There's no way that we can learn all of that. We can read about countries and cultures, but the norms and the behaviors, that comes out in everyday life. So it's okay to say, I'm not really sure about what happened here. I don't want to take this the wrong way. Were you kidding when you said this and this? So I think it's better to do that than to assume. There have been, many incidents where people have gotten into conflicts at work because someone made a joke and the other person felt offended. And so it's important to discuss humor and, cultural humor, also how people joke around so that there's a little bit of less tension around that.
Now I'm thinking about my own intercultural experiences, and really it's very easy to assume that somebody is just, bitter or maybe sarcastic, and you're maybe stepping away from this person because you don't want to be exposed to this, but then it might have been humor and you would have perceived it differently. So instead of making this assumption, especially if it repeats with your neighbor or at work, then it's good to address that. Or I'm imagining maybe you can ask a colleague of this person or another person, what do you think? Was he joking? Was this a joke? Maybe I didn't quite get that.
Most definitely. And the thing is that, that this unwritten rule that if a Dane is joking with you, that means that they like you. Even if you feel that maybe the joke was a bit like they were picking on you or so that's actually a sign of affection. And a lot of people don't know that. So it's also good to keep that in mind. I think it's hard a lot of times for us internationals being in a new place because we feel very vulnerable. And so when such things happen, we for some reason often assume the worst instead of, thinking of that this is not something bad. And as you said, also asking a colleague if we don't feel comfortable asking the person directly, just to get some more insight and not to make these stories in our heads that are negative, right?
That's true. Asking a colleague would be my safe way to
and that's good
to go.
Yeah.
One more question which I want to ask you is about being fresh, being a newcomer at work, in a workplace. What shall we potential newcomers pay attention to? What is appreciated in a workplace in Denmark? What would be your hints about that?
I would say first and foremost, honesty. And again, this can be hard. So we are expected to take initiative and be honest. If we can't complete a task, or if we don't know how to do that, or if we're going to be late for the deadline, we really have to keep in mind that it is our job to first try. Danes are very big on that. don't come to people asking for help if you haven't tried first. If you've tried and it's difficult or it's not going the way you would want it to go, then go ask someone for help. Very welcome. They are super helpful. They are so good. But it's important to make sure that you have tried first. Second thing, always be upfront with your managers, with the team leaders. I won't be able to make this deadline. I'm having some issues with this and this in good time so that people can come together and find a solution. So not trying to hide the fact that we're struggling, but being really upfront with things. Being able to confront people if you feel uncomfortable with something, if you feel, out of place, or this is not something you're used to. Always being honest, not trying to hide things and trying to fix it yourself. It's so appreciated because that's the trust. The trust is based on honesty. And you really see it in the workplace as well as outside of the workplace, but in the workplace especially. So it might be new for a lot of people to be really upfront, especially if it's something that we're struggling with because we feel like we're failing. But that's not the case. That's actually showing that you're a team player, that you're looking out for everyone and you're looking out for the project, and that you're also being able to admit, this is new for me. That's very appreciated. The last thing I would say that comes to mind is really being aware that you won't be micromanaged, that you find your way of working, and that no one will be coming in to check up on you, how you're doing with this deadline, what's happening. So that's, again, right, this honesty and trust is there from the beginning. When you walk into your job, you're given trust. You're given this wonderful gift. So it's really important that you cultivate it and you keep in mind that this is something that you are already handed, and not to do anything that might damage it in any way. So being aware that no one will be looking over your shoulder. It's your responsibility to be really in charge of how you're working and making sure that things are running smoothly. And if they're not, to come and be really forward about what's happening.
So what I'm hearing from you is that there is so much attention given to being independent, yes, like self-sufficient in the first place. And only after your self-sufficiency is not enough, you go to ask other people, and then they know you're in a position to be helped, to be supported. The other thing which you mentioned is what I'm thinking many companies actually struggle with on a global scale. Yes. How shall I talk about my obstacles which I'm meeting? How shall I talk about my failures, some difficulties that I'm facing? In many cultures, talking about that is easy when you talk to a friend. Then you simply go in this kind of a mode of a complaining, please cheer me up. But talking about that to a colleague or to a boss is like a thing that you would never do, yes? So it might be a very big cultural difference for people coming from majority of the world, I would say.
It's true.
Because if I'm working with companies which have the Nordic or the even a Western European from some countries origin, they are trying to invite this culture of direct feedback and directly addressing each other onto the whole corporation. But it's such a challenge. I think there is an assumption, there is a big barrier in our heads before we learn to do that. So what's the advice that you give to foreigners? How can they overcome this mental barrier and really be able to talk about some obstacles that they are facing before it is too late?
I think you have to, first and foremost, balance this, right? It's the employees and it's also the leadership. So if we have an international company, I think everyone has to be aware that it is an international company. So yes, of course, if we want to have, the Nordic way of working or living, that's really important. But then it will have to be tweaked. So it won't just work if we lay it on the table and say, this is how we do things. We've seen this. It fails. And it goes both ways, right? So it's a mindset. It's understanding people. It is individual. We might have some people who really, really struggle with saying, I'm not doing well here. This is something that's new for me. And some people will 100% not be able to do this in a forum, in a meeting. So then it's up to the leadership, the management, to realize that and to have that conversation one-on-one instead of having it in a forum, right? Same thing with feedback. Some people are really good at having feedback in the forum and they're okay with it. Other people will struggle and they will feel really vulnerable and attacked and get defensive. So again, it's really about reading the team. It's really about finding a balance, what works for which person, right? There's one of my clients, one of the leaders, she said herself, she has a diverse group, people from different countries. And some people, for example, before they start the meeting, need a little bit of chit chat. Other people go right into the agenda. So there's a lot to really think about with international teams, with international companies. I don't think there's a quick fix. I don't think there's a cookie cutter method. I think people really have to look at their teams, their companies, their work culture, and have a lot of discussions around that and have open discussions. I think if leadership comes and starts discussing this, then people will slowly probably start opening up because it's something they won't be used to, right? It'll be different from what they have experienced. And then it's the trust factor, because coming from some countries, we will think, okay, is it real? Are they serious about this? I still feel uncomfortable. I don't think I should be able to say that because that undermines my qualifications or the quality of work that I do. So I think it's a long process to change that. But again, I feel like it's a little bit like Hygge. We can't just label it as the Nordic way of working or this is Hygge. I think it really has to be modified depending on the group's individuals' experiences, how we want this to look. It has to be a group project. I don't think it comes from one person or just the top putting it on people and saying, this is how we're doing it. Such things never work. If people are not on board and don't feel comfortable, it won't work.
But it's also a lot on individual shoulders or happening in the individual head of a newcomer to Denmark, getting familiar with this way of work and then taking the courage, maybe even taking the risk to try. And I'm imagining someone could say, it's not what we do in my culture, but I heard that in Denmark you appreciate direct feedback. So this is what I'm saying. Yes, just, experimenting with this a little bit. I'm thinking also about this networking, which you mentioned. Now, when someone goes into a networking opportunity and he or she presents themselves to other people, now, how shall we present ourselves so that we are perceived in the right way? And here I'm making a reference to this idea. I wonder how predominant is it in Denmark, really, everybody being equal, also in the sense of not showing off. So what I'm thinking, in some meetings, people try to make an impression on you by showing off, yes, really saying a lot of great things about themselves. Now, to what extent would this build credibility in Denmark? And if not, what would be the right way?
This is such a good point, Monika, and such a good question. It's true. There is a lot of really a sense of equality, that we are all equal. And there is, of course, this whole notion of not standing out too much, of not being pompous or bragging too much. This is a huge thing. Even with LinkedIn, when I have worked with internationals on the topic of LinkedIn, because they already were forewarned, they would say, okay, well, how do I make a post that doesn't sound like I'm bragging? And then also with Danes. So you see really a big difference. And there was an example, I don't remember, it was in one of the books I read about, I don't know if it was Aaron Meyer, maybe it could have been. But anyway, where you have a meeting, you have an American and a Swede. And the American, they're supposed to present a project that they were working on. And the American is highlighting himself. We're stereotyping here right now, right? But it's just to show the difference. So the American is highlighting himself and he's using I a lot, whereas the Swede is using the team and the project. And this is the same in Denmark. So we would want to, of course, present ourselves, but we wouldn't be saying, I did this and I went to this school and I achieved this and I was nominated. You would not do that. You would talk more about, I was involved in this and this project and we worked on these types of innovations or finding solutions. So you would flip it more to the concrete examples of your work and the skills that were used, instead of taking yourself and elevating all the I's and what I have achieved and done. because of course, in Denmark, it's very important. One thing is your skills and your talents. The other thing is also you fitting in with the team or department. This is a huge thing. So every interview, that's also what everyone is looking for. Will this person be a good match to the people we already have? Will they be able to work together? Because working together is a huge thing. So it's not individual. It's all looked at as a group effort, as a team. So keeping that in mind when we're networking, and also really focusing on the value. So presenting the value that we could potentially bring to the person that we're talking to. And again, it's focused on how we do things and not so much me as me, right? Because that's the big thing with networking, depending on what we're looking for. A lot of internationals go into networking sessions and they're looking for work. So the thing is, we don't ask people for jobs. We don't ask people for their contacts, for their network. That's a huge no-no. We would never ask someone, even if we know that they know someone that we would like to meet, we would never ask that person to introduce us. We would wait for them to initiate that themselves if they felt comfortable, which often would probably not be the case if they have just met you for the first time, because the trust comes up again. People have to trust you in order to share their network with you, because it's also their reputation that they're putting on the line if they're referring someone to another person. So trust is huge. The other thing is that, you can ask in the sense that saying, like, if you were me, how would you go about getting in touch with this person? So this is a very neutral way of saying, I know that you know this person. Can you help me out? And then they will decide. They will say, you can go to the company website and their email is there. And then you know that they are putting a bit of distance. They're not willing to put themselves in between you and that person. Or they could say, I find your work very interesting. I think that maybe it could be a good match for you to meet and have a coffee meeting. And then you know that the person feels comfortable, or they feel that, the value you're bringing is quite important to their contact or to themselves, depending on how we're looking at this networking layout. But the thing is that we are more reserved with networking, and everyone goes into it knowing that, of course, people are looking for mutual benefits, but we don't say it straight out. We would be more reserved, and we would really present how we can add value to that person or to their business or to their network, depending on what we're discussing.
That's really precious. Now, I was thinking about my experience in Finland. I was in a class where we were learning to write your CV, yes, and to write your letter of
reference,
whatever you call this letter, yes, this application letter, yes. And I wrote my letter. I was so proud of it. And the teacher told me, but there is so much I here. Maybe you can change it. And I was thinking, how can I change, I understand that it repeats itself in every sentence, because that's the way the English language works, that you start the I sentences with an I word. And I was at a loss. I only later understood what she meant. And she meant something like what you explained. On the other hand, I just had this meeting with a client from India, and we talked about a speaker for their event. And they told me, but please present us the speaker, and it was clear that they wanted like kind of a big person, yes, with many official titles, with a lot of prestige, yes. And I'm thinking, if we work internationally, how can we balance it out?
It's hard.
Maybe we need to have two separate profiles, one for the countries that expect prestige, and then the other countries that expect more of this equality and more of this, what value do I bring, yes, approach,
so
and the togetherness.
So true.
Maybe.
I think that would be, that would definitely be a way to do it, because it is very different. Also with the titles, you don't have that really here. No one uses it. No one, you wouldn't see PhD or on just in a work. Of course, if you're a doctor, yes, but in a corporate sense, you wouldn't have all these titles behind your name. Also on your business card, which we really don't use anymore because we have LinkedIn, and but it just came to my mind. Now you know how old I am. But But it's not important. I mean, your boss, the CEO, they will just use their first name and people call them by their first name. You don't use all these titles after you don't also use their surname, right? Mr. da-da-da. That would just be really strange.
Yes, so it's really about sometimes taking a courage to behave differently at workplace, yes, to try and make an experiment, to take the risk and be courageous, and then really showing yourself as a reliable, equal person, responsible person, self-sufficient colleague in the work. I think it's so valuable. Thank you so much, Kathy. I really appreciate it so much. Is there any last general advice that you would give to anybody who would like to make friends with the Danes, have a good start in Denmark, and really have this happy life that Denmark is very
I have
for?
two things. One, and I will say this because happiness for me is a bit tricky to use. I know Denmark has been labeled as this kind of country, and also all the other Scandinavian countries. I don't use that word. I use content. So I do believe that Denmark is a really place where we feel content. We're happy with feeling secure, but I wouldn't use the word happiness, not necessarily to describe the Danes. And we're generalizing again here, but I would use contentment. And the other thing I would say, if you are moving abroad anywhere, but also to Denmark, I think you really have to be true to yourself. I think you should be aware of who you are, not to lose yourself, even if you want to do a deep dive into that new place, country, or culture. And also to be able to say, this is my boundary, to be authentic and not to get pushed into situations and even working in a way that's not comfortable for you. I think it's about finding a balance and also to be able to say, I can, push myself a little bit here, but this is totally out of my comfort zone. And I'm not comfortable doing that or working in that way or speaking up in that way. I think it's important to make sure that we are comfortable where we are, and it's okay not to dive in full force from this giant cliff right away if we don't want to.
It really brings a lot of peace of mind to have this attitude and not require too much of ourselves. Thank you so much, Kathy. I really loved having the conversation with you.
Thank you for having me. Such a huge pleasure. Thanks so much, Monika.
Well, moving to another country is always a process in itself, and we are all a part of it. Secondly, be present and be involved. Find opportunities to meet Danish people where they naturally spend their time. It might be around hobbies and leisure or around professional opportunities. And finally, learn new ways and extend your flexibility, but also stay yourself in whatever you do. If you like to find the notes to this podcast episode, you will find them at www.astepahead.pro/008. This is the number of this episode. And if you don't like the idea of missing out on any new content, you might join the newsletter. To do so, you also go to the same website, www.astepahead.pro, and at the very top of the page, you see a link, newsletter. Just leave your email address there. If you are a LinkedIn user, you might also want to join A Step Ahead by Monika Chutnik profile to see some backstage pictures or to be informed about what new topics are coming up in the upcoming weeks and months. Other resources that are already on the portal and that you might find interesting is, for example, the episode about Ukrainians, how to find a great candidate and how to ensure good onboarding of a new colleague from Ukraine. That's an episode number 2, so astepahead.pro/002. 2. There are so many ways to feel included and also to make others feel included, also if they are newcomers to your country, but also if you want to establish those little connections with them. I recommend you the piece about what are microaffirmations and why you want to have them in your team, a conversation with Ben Capel, episode number 4, so /004. This is how you will find this episode. And finally, what we want to feel in a new country is to feel safe, feel psychologically safe, also feel the safety to take risks, to make something which is maybe awkward, funny, but also live with the consequences in a positive and entrepreneurial way. Psychological safety, this is what you might find interesting. We are talking about especially the virtual context, 4 steps to mastery with Katarzyna Romanowicz, and that's the episode number 3, so 003. This is what you put after the /. That's all for today. Thank you very much, take care, and goodbye.